Please turn to your Bibles. Am I too loud? No? Okay. Well, last week we came to the end of our series of studies on the life of Abraham. And then Lizzie told me that for the mornings we were going to do a series of studies on the life of Moses. So I thought, well, there you are. That's a prompt from the Lord. Because what I'd like to try and do is take the same topics that we're doing in the mornings, but maybe build on them, give you some more information, paint the picture, hopefully, maybe a bit more widely for you, so that you can get excited about what God is doing in these people's lives. So tonight, we're going to read, first of all, from Exodus chapter 1. The last verse, and then the first 10 verses of chapter 2. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the river bank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." Now I want you to go into the New Testament now, to the book of Acts. Acts chapter 6. Acts chapter 7, verse 17. And you'll maybe recall that this is the speech that this lovely Christian guy called Stephen made when he was arrested, probably, and he reviewed the history of Israel, and he was showing how it all pointed to Jesus. And as a result of what he said in this sermon, it cost him his life. But there's details in this sermon that we don't get anywhere else. And I'm so glad that he made this sermon. Verse 17 says, "As the time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt had greatly increased. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. He dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our ancestors by forcing them to throw out their newborn babies so that they would die. At that time Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for by his family, and when he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. There's one final reading in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. This is the chapter that's the roll call of all the famous Old Testament saints and their faithfulness. And verse 23 says this: "By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict." And so may God bless these readings of his word tonight. So Lord, as we have read your word, and in many ways we're conscious this is a familiar passage to us, we pray that your Spirit would take up your word and take its lessons and weave them into our hearts, the very center of our beings, that we might catch the messages, catch the things that you're trying to say to us, and build them into our own lives, so that we might be a people today who are like these saints of old. So Lord, come by your Spirit and speak into our hearts now, we ask. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, I shall try and set the scene of what was happening almost 4,000 years ago. And I like to try and imagine things and try and think of what it was like. But almost 400 years before the events that took place here in Exodus chapters 1 and 2, almost 400 years before that, the Israelites' ancestor Joseph, you remember Joseph? Yeah? And Joseph became a great prime minister of Egypt. He was very important in the history of Egypt because he had saved the nation at a time of famine, and he helped to make Egypt great. And Egypt became one of the most prominent powers in the ancient world at that time. And he'd also rescued his family, if you remember, his brothers and his dad. They all came from the land of Canaan at the time of famine, and Joseph fed them too. But he did more than that for them. He enabled them to settle in the land of Egypt, in a part of the land that is called Goshen. And these Israelite people, the Israelite clan, had basked in Joseph's glory for many years. I don't know if you know anything about Goshen or where it was, but it was situated in the side by the banks of the River Nile. It was reckoned to be the best and the most fertile of all the lands of Egypt. And it was a place where their flocks and herds had prospered. And because of Joseph's position, Pharaoh at that time had agreed, and more than agreed actually, had demanded that Joseph's family would have the best of the land. He was showing his thanks to Joseph and to his family for all that he had done. And so they had enjoyed the fresh and plentiful leeks, the melons, the garlic. Remember later on that that's what they longed for. They hankered after the leeks, the melons, and the garlic. It was a fertile place. It was a fruitful place. And they greatly multiplied in number. And by this time, their numbers would have been in the million. More than 1 million. I think there was 70 in all that entered the land. And now there was over 1 million of them. Life was good. And many of them had begun to worship the idols of Egypt, of which there were a lot. They had turned away from God and become idolatrous. And now, some 320 years after they had settled in Egypt, a very different Pharaoh is on the throne of Egypt. And he wasn't favorably disposed to this people. He couldn't remember anything about Joseph. He couldn't care less about Joseph. And he actually looked on the Israelites as being a threat. And he knew he had to do something about them. And this is what he did. He enslaved them and used them to labor in the land, to labor in the fields, to do building work. And they were used to do some of the big building projects like building pyramids, building the store cities that were built nearby to the Nile Delta, that fertile Nile Delta, where they stored their goods and they made it ready to go out and be sent abroad. But Pharaoh felt increasingly threatened. And he ordered, as we have read tonight, all of the newborn sons in Israelite families to be thrown into the river Nile, to be drowned in the Nile. But the little girls were to be left alive. And in Exodus chapter 2, in verse 1, we're introduced to the central characters of tonight's reading. A married couple of the tribe of Levi. Now, the tribe of Levi would later on become the priestly tribe. Okay? They aren't named here. You have to wait until you get into chapter 6 before they're named. And in chapter 6, verse 20, they're identified as Amram and Jochebed. Strangely, they were related. Amram married his aunt. Did you know that? At that time, you could do that. Amram and Jochebed. Now, I've told you before that names are significant, particularly Bible names. Amram's name is meaning exalted people. So he realized that he was born into a nation that was special. And of course, we know this nation is special. But he's not actually the main character. It's the wife who is the main character. And her name is Jochebed. And I would be surprised if any of you know what Jochebed means. But listen to this, it means Jehovah is our glory. Jehovah is my glory. I think that tells us something about this lady, that God meant a lot to her. And she's actually the first person in the Bible to have her name linked to Jehovah, which is really the Old Testament name for Lord. And I think as we read through the story and as it unfolds, we discover that her name was real. And Jehovah really was her Lord. And they had 2 children. One was called Miriam, and she would have been about 10 years of age at this time. And she had a little brother. His name was Aaron. And he would have been about 3 years of age. And Aaron, you remember, became the first in the priestly line of the clan Levi. And Jochebed fell pregnant for the 3rd time during the time of Pharaoh's edict that all the male children should be killed. Try and imagine what it must have been like amongst the Israelites at that time. If your wife fell pregnant, what would go through your mind? You'd be hoping it was a girl. You'd be living in fear that the child that was going to be born was going to be a boy. It was even worse for the midwives, and there's 2 midwives that are identified in chapter 1. And they were instructed if they were at a birth and a boy was born, then they were to make sure that that child would die. And they didn't obey Pharaoh. And when Pharaoh brought them in before him and said, "Why have you not killed these boys?" They made up a story. They told a lie. You know, well, the Bible never advocates for us to tell lies, but they had to say something. And they said that the Hebrew women were too lively. So they had their babies before the midwives even arrived. That's a good story, isn't it? But you know this? God honored them. And we're told that God gave them children. God honors those who honor him, doesn't he? He really does. And so these things were happening in Goshen in the land of Egypt. But it was also, I want to suggest, a time of great importance in the heavenly realms. And this is what I mean by that. Because it was 360 years after the Israelites had settled in Egypt. And remember this, they had become very settled. They were very happy there. But this wasn't to be the land that God has chosen to give them. It wasn't the promised land. To them it must have seemed like the promised land, but it wasn't. The land of Canaan was to be the land that they were to settle in. But now they weren't settled anymore because life was so hard and it was going to get a lot harder. Caroline, you were mentioning earlier that when people really are struggling, that is often the time that they turn to God for answers. And very soon these people were going to cry out to God and ask God to save them. They were slaves, and they were beginning to long for freedom. And remember this, that God had promised to Abraham hundreds of years before, that after 400 years in Egypt, he would bring them back to Canaan. And that's why I'm telling you that this is a time of great importance in the heavenly realms. Because that time of 400 years was rapidly approaching. It was only 80 years away when this little baby was born. And at that very time, when circumstances were at their darkest, Jochebed falls pregnant and she gives birth to this male child. You'll notice that she doesn't give him a name. But I suspect he did have a name, a Hebrew name, that we're not told anything about, because we don't need to know about that name. But what I want to say is this, that Jochebed was a woman of great courage and great faith. Amram seems to, just dissolve into the background, and Jochebed comes to the foreground. And she's one of these women of great faith that are highlighted throughout the Bible, and they're honored and they're exalted. And I'm just so glad that today we have so many women of great faith. And that they're cornerstones in the church and such a blessing to the church. How do I know that Jochebed was a woman of great faith and courage? Well, there's 3 reasons I would like to suggest. The first one is because of her name. Jehovah is my glory. And when many of her neighbors and friends and fellow countrymen had turned their back on the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and they were worshipping the multitudes of gods that there were in the land of Egypt, Jochebed didn't do that. Jehovah was her glory. And she loved the God of her ancestors. And then, secondly, in Hebrews chapter 11, where we read tonight, It says this, that the parents weren't afraid of the king's edict. They had courage. They had boldness. They weren't going to hand over their child to be thrown into the River Nile and to die. They would do anything to preserve the life of their newborn son. They were courageous. I think it wouldn't have mattered what it cost them. They were going to do everything in their power to protect their son. And the third reason is this. The description that's given to the newborn child. I don't know if you really picked up on the various descriptions. He was no ordinary child. He's described as a fine child, a beautiful child. You can also translate that as being fair to God. There was something about this child that was different. You could see it just by looking at him. He was extraordinary. No, ordinary means extraordinary. And I think they knew in their hearts that the child that Jochebed had given birth to was a child that had an important destiny and had a plan for his life that had been mapped out by the living God. And so he was their miracle child. And they had faith to believe that God had a great plan for him. Can I suggest to you that he's really a picture of another miracle child that should never have lived? And he was born into the world. Jesus, his name was. And he became our Savior. And in the book of Hebrews, in the early chapters, it exalts the name of Moses in the person of Moses. But then the writer of the book of Hebrews says, effectively, a greater than Moses is here. He was the greatest of all miracle children. And so for Amram and Jochebed, not for them the idols of Egypt, they trusted in the living God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph. They had great courage, and they had great faith. F.B. Meyer, in his lovely devotional commentary on the life of Moses, he says there are 5 important prerequisites of true faith, real faith. And I just want to quickly just give them to you now. First is the sense of helplessness and nothingness. The truth is that we can't bring anything to God. And it's only when we come with that true sense of real helplessness to God that God really starts to move in our lives. Number 2 is an absolute assurance of being on God's plan. Number 1, first of all, believing that there is a plan that God has for your life and wanting to be at the center of that plan. The third thing that F.B. Meyer says is this entire consecration, that God can work out his will through heart and life. I think we see that in Amram and Jochebed. Their lives were wholly devoted to God, and they wanted their child to be devoted to God. That's all that really mattered to them in their lives. Number 4, there is the daily food of promise. Faithful people stand on the promises of God. And I don't think Amram and Jochebed would have been entirely ignorant of the promise that God had made to Abraham. That 400 years after the family of Jacob came to live in the land of Egypt, they were going to leave again. And I have this strange feeling in my heart that they knew their child was going to be a key to them coming out of the land of Egypt. Now, how they would know that, I don't know. But there's every indication as we've read about this child that there was something extraordinary about him. Maybe it was something that the Spirit of God just imprinted in Mum's heart. But they were standing in the promises of God. And lastly, number 5 is this. To be prepared to do a daring act. Ever done daring acts for God? In utter independence of feeling, on a faith that totally believes in God's faithfulness. Would you do that for God? When the thing that you're sensing that He's asking you to do doesn't make sense? When you feel that you're not gifted enough? Or have enough time? Or have enough resources and money? Or enough experience because you've never been there before? But yet God is calling you to it. And He's asking you to do it. Would you do that daring act? And travel in an adventure with the living God. Well, that's what Amram and Jochebed were doing. That's what little Moses would grow up to do in subsequent years. Because they had faith in the living God. I think God, for more than anything, is looking for people with faith today. Faith like that. Just to make their lives count for Him. And I wonder if that describes our faith. Do a faith inventory someday. Will you? And see how you match up to these 5 points that I've just mentioned just now. And so the little baby is born, and the proud mum kept her son secret for 3 months. Now, that must have been some challenge. Yeah. Having had 4 children ourselves, keeping them quiet was quite a challenge. Yeah, and there's some mums who are here tonight. You know, we've got neighbours who've got children. And there are some times when I heard the very young child crying, and I could hear it next door. Because children can make a lot of noise, can't they? Tiny little babies. What a volume that comes out of these tiny little packages. How did Jochebed do it? I don't know. I suspect that the little baby got nursed an awful lot for 3 months until the time came when she knew she'd just not keep that secret any longer. The neighbours were going to find out. The Egyptians were going to find out. And then they would pay the cost. And she comes up with a plan that could only really have come from God. Don't you think so? And here's what she does. She gets a basket. The word can be translated an ark. This little papyrus basket, and she puts tar underneath it so that it's waterproof. She knows exactly what she's going to do. It's a little boat. And she puts her little baby, 3-month-old baby, into this boat. And she puts a cover on it. And she goes down to the banks of the River Nile. She places it in the reeds. She doesn't place it just in any old place. She places it in the exact spot that she knows that Pharaoh's daughter comes to bathe. Wow. Would we have done that? And this is the way that she thinks that God is going to save him. History tells us about Pharaoh's daughter. History would give us her name. And I'm glad that it does, because her name was Thermutis. Thermutis. And here's what it means. First mother. I think that there was a motherly heart in Pharaoh's daughter that would be melted when she saw a child. Now, I just love to come to Mainly Music. I love to be out amongst children. There's just something about little children that just melts my heart. And I love to be with them and talk to them and interact with them. And that's what mums do, isn't it? And that's, I think, what Thermutis liked to do. And she's coming along with her maidens, her servants, one day, just after Jochebed puts this little ark into the river. And as she's going past the very spot, she hears a cry. And she asks one of her ladies to go and find out what that noise was. And she comes back with this basket. And she takes the lid off of the top. And Thermutis looked in and she saw this child. But then she heard the child. I don't know of any woman whose heart is not moved when they hear a child crying. I think it's something that's inbuilt, isn't it? Just to be moved, to do something when a child cries, to want to stop it crying. And it's that produces the bond between the mum and the child. And we're told she felt sorry for him. And her motherly heart rose within her. And Jochebed, wise old Jochebed, had involved her little girl, Miriam, in the plan. And so Miriam's not too far away where all this is happening. And Miriam just asked the question, would you like me to go and get somebody that could look after him for you? And I don't for a moment think that Thermutis didn't know what was going on. I think she did. And when she went and got Jochebed, it would be quite obvious she was a nursing mum. And this little baby was given to her, back to her mum by Thermutis. And Thermutis, who was going to take this child to be her own, says to Jochebed, you look after him until he's weaned, and then return him to me. Not only that, but she actually pays Jochebed to look after her own child. Isn't that amazing? Only God can do that kind of stuff. And Thermutis is the person who gives the baby his name, Moses. And it means drawn out, rescued out, drawn out of the water. Yeah, what a wonderful name to have. And Moses becomes the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And it's reckoned he could have been perhaps 4 years of age, maybe older than 4 years of age, by the time Jochebed returns him to Thermutis. Now, when we think of a child being weaned, we probably think maximum of a year, something like that. But that wasn't the case in these days. So he could have been 4 or 5 years of age. Now, it's reckoned that the first 5 years of a child's life are the most important formative years. And during that precious time, I suspect that Jochebed poured into her little boy's mind and heart all she knew about God. She would have told the little boy about their history, about their God, about the great things that God had done for their ancestors, the wonderful living God that He is. And that would have been fiercely planted into his heart. It reminds me of little Timothy. Remember how he grew up to know the scriptures from his gran and from his mum when he was a tiny little boy. And I would just want to encourage mums to pour into the hearts of your children as much of God as you possibly can, even although they are very young. It will shape them for the rest of their lives. And Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7, and it's really a wonderful legacy for us today, because we learn things from him that we don't learn elsewhere. And he tells us three key things about Moses' early life. And the first thing is this, that he was brought up as Pharaoh's daughter's son. He was adopted into the family. Potentially, he could become the heir to the throne. We're not told, there's no indication that Thermutis had any other children before she had this adopted child. And she's called First Mother of the nation of Israel. The second thing is that we're told by Stephen is this, that he was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Now, he would have gone to the Oxford University of the land of Egypt. They did have these kind of things. We think of people 4,000 years ago or living in caves and, not knowing anything. The Egyptians were a hugely sophisticated nation. They designed and they built the pyramids and all of the wonderful things that can still be seen in that land. They were a nation of engineers, of farmers. They were brilliant in their time. They were world leading. And young Moses would have grown up with their education. It was called the Temple of the Sun. And that's where all the important children in the nation of Egypt went to learn. It was the Oxford of Egypt. And that was his education. Everything that could be known about Egypt, he would have learned as he grew up. But already planted into his heart by his mum was everything that she knew of the living God. And that was something that could never ever be taken out of his heart, even although he was going to become an Egyptian. And the third thing that we learn from Stephen is this, that Moses grew up in the first 40 years of his life to be powerful in speech. I think he showed all of the potential to be the leader of the land of Egypt. I think he had all of the potential to become a great statesman. He was powerful in speech. And the second thing that we're told is that he was powerful in action. Now, it wasn't unusual in these days for nations to be involved in wars. And Egypt was certainly a nation that was involved in wars with the nations around them. And I think in that simple phrase that Moses was powerful in action would tell us this, that he grew up to serve in the army and possibly had become one of the army commanders. You would expect that of the son of the king of Egypt. He would have risen to prominence in the Egyptian army. He would have been a strategist. And so you can see as you think about the young age of Moses, how this was a child who grew up with great ability and great potential in the nation of Egypt. He was equipped to be a great leader. But he never forgot where his roots were. He wasn't an Egyptian. He was an Israelite. And next week, we're going to discover how important that was. What do we take away tonight? I want you to focus your thoughts on Jochebed. That woman of courage and faith. She would have sacrificed everything for her son. And she did everything within her power to shape his life so that God would use him in the years ahead. That was God's plan for her life. If you're a mom, that's part of God's plan for your life, is to shape the lives of your children and pour into their hearts everything about God that you know. That was her plan at that stage of her life. And what a difference that made in the years ahead. And it shaped the life and the destiny of her son and the life and the destiny of their nation. Yeah. What we offer to God is never in vain. Never, ever in vain. So God bless his word to you tonight. I hope that you maybe discovered some things about Moses and about his family that you didn't know before, that excites you. These are the things that excites me about the word of God. So we'll stop there, and Caroline will sing us another song, or lead us in another song, and we'll help. And then I'll pray after that.